The common American perception of the French during World War II is quite clear. The French crumpled under the German offensive, surrendered early, and offered little help in the coming battles of the European theater. In reality, the story of the French resistance is not one of cowardice, retreat, and surrender, but one of heroism, bravery, and sacrifice. None better embody these traits than hero of the French resistance, Jean Moulin. Through his given task of uniting resistance forces within occupied France into one organization, Jean Moulin's stand against German occupational forces created a legacy that significantly altered the course of World War II history, saving countless Allied lives and bringing a quicker end to the war.
To discuss Moulin's impact, we must first recognize his actions. On June 17, 1940, 5 days before France's official surrender, Moulin was arrested by Gestapo for refusing to sign a document which falsely blamed African French army soldiers for raping and murdering French women and children. After suffering torture and being locked in a cell with the grisly remains of a bombing victim, Moulin instead decided to commit suicide rather than sign the document, slitting his throat with a piece of glass. Hearing him, a guard brought Moulin to the hospital. After his recovery, Moulin was freed and returned to his job as a French government official under the Vichy regime. This new French government had cooperated with Nazi Germany after France's surrender. Jean Moulin associated with the ideology of French republicanism, believing that power belonged in the hands of the people. The fact that the Vichy government was leaning towards fascism, actively arresting and deporting those considered undesirable by Nazi standards, was deplorable in Moulin's eyes. He refused to carry out moral orders to fire all left-wing mayors and was subsequently fired himself. It was this final offense that pushed Moulin to take his stand and join the French resistance. Through established contact with French resistors, Moulin was smuggled to London in September of 1941. There, he met Charles de Gaulle, leader of the Free French Army, the remnants of the Third French Republic who had sided with the Allied forces after their exile by the German military. After offering his services to de Gaulle, Moulin was given the weighty responsibility of uniting resistance forces within occupied France under de Gaulle so they could coordinate themselves with Allied troop movements. Unlike the Free French Army, the various resistance groups within France, known as the French Forces of the Interior, or FFI, lacked coordination in favor of sporadic guerrilla attacks in order to harass German forces. In January of 1942, Jean Moulin parachuted back into occupied France to establish an organization made up of the primary French resistance groups, trade union groups, and political parties opposed to the Vichy regime. This resistance force could cooperate with and be directed by de Gaulle, allowing for resistance on the Allied front and behind enemy lines. After several months of convincing these groups that uniting was in their best interest to liberate France, Moulin arranged their first meeting on May 27, 1943 in an apartment building. The fruits of this massive undertaking had now become the Conseil National de Résistance, or National Council of Resistance, with Moulin at its head.
Despite initiating what would develop into the pinnacle of French resistance, Moulin would not live long past the council's creation. On June 21st, Moulin was arrested by Gestapo after being betrayed by a captured council member. For days he experienced agonizing torture at the hands of infamous Gestapo officer Klaus Barbie. Hot needles were shoved under his fingernails. His fingers were forced between the hinges of a door and a wall, and the door was slammed until the knuckles broke. Screw-levered handcuffs were tightened to cruelly dig into his wrists. Despite his immense suffering, Moulin refused to supply information to his tormentors, sparing the lives of numerous resistance members. The days of torture left Moulin with internal bleeding and lacerations, and he perished in a train car on its way to Germany on July 8, 1943. He had done his part. The council was safe. It would now lead to greater cooperation within the interior French forces and coordination with the major Allied powers. The massive Allied invasion of Normandy, known as Operation Overlord or D-Day, marked a turning point during World War II, the decline of Germany's hold on Western Europe. Beginning on June 6th and ending in late August of 1944, the battle was vital to put pressure on the Axis powers by opening a new war front. Failure would have meant at best another year of war, allowing completion of the Nazis' final solution, and at worst, an Axis victory of World War II. As 160,000 Allied troops prepared to assault the seemingly impenetrable fortress Europe, preparations were being made amongst the French resistance. The French forces of the interior were now united under de Gaulle, thanks to Moulin's National Council of Resistance, ready to carry out organized resistance against the defending German army, behind their lines. It is clear that without Moulin's efforts, the French resistance would have lacked the organizational structure to meaningfully participate in the operation. As an American report for General Eisenhower stated, "All our information leads us to believe that the only authority these resistance groups desire to recognize is that of de Gaulle and his committee, a direct result of the Council of National Resistance's establishment. Had the French resistance been left in its prior fragmented state, coordinating with the Allied invasion would have been incredibly difficult, if not impossible." Andre Heinz, surviving member of the French resistance and participant in Operation Overlord, affirmed their efficiency in halting German communications when he spoke at the European Eyewitness D-Day Accounts Symposium, stating,
"The order was try and hinder all German communications as much as you can for the next 10 hours. Fortunately, the railroad people, and there were very good groups of resistance among them, and that night all the railroad tracks were cut at least in one or two places. Also, the people in charge of what is called in French PTT, Post, Telephone and Telegraphs, had among them many resistors too, and they were able to disrupt quite efficiently the telephone lines, including those that they had found out that linked the German headquarters together."
These acts of resistance, both violent and peaceful, hindered the arrival of German supplies and reinforcements, lessening the pressure put on the main Allied invasion force. Though around 9,000 Allied troops died in battle, the actions of the French resistance ensured the casualties were reduced to a minimum, and that less time was wasted securing the shores. Despite this significant contribution, mention of the French resistance is obscured by the larger forces involved. It is undeniable that the French resistance played a critical role in one of the most impactful battles of World War II, a role able to be carried out thanks to Jean Moulin's original stand against occupational forces.
After the shores of Normandy and the rural portions of France had been secured, the road to Paris had been paved. As the Allied forces loosened the Nazi grasp on the French countryside, an internal power struggle began. The French forces of the interior were preparing their uprising behind closed doors in the City of Lights, while the Free French Army rallied with the Americans just outside of Paris, resupplied with American firearms and vehicles. The organization of these forces was no small feat, as these tens of thousands of men had to invade and uprise simultaneously and without failure. With the assistance of resistance contacts in the Council and Allied communications, the Free French Army's 2nd Division and the US 4th Division merged in the outskirts of Paris and began the liberation of the city. This connection gave the Allies ample manpower to directly move into the city, as opposed to the original plan of encircling it and pushing from all sides. Eisenhower stated that, "We wanted to avoid making Paris a battleground and consequently planned operations to cut off and surround the vicinity. We could not know, of course, the exact condition and situation of the city's population. In this matter, my hand was forced by the action of the Free French forces inside Paris. Had the US not been able to meet with the Free French, their circumambulation of Paris would have been detrimental to Allied forces, costing precious time and troops. As the armored divisions began to push into the city, civilian resistance members stormed German garrisons, barricaded streets, and began their effort to take back their city. The internal conflict weakened the German defenses as they had to fight a two-front battle. After the initial uprising on August 19, 1944, and the subsequent armored Allied assault, the Germans surrendered on the 25th. Due to continued support from the Allies and proper strategic organization, the FFI only lost 1,600 men, half of what the militarily superior German army lost. The remaining 13,000 German troops were captured. In less than a week of fighting, the Allies' cooperative effort with the French forces had liberated Paris from the Nazis' 4-year rule. The quick and efficient takeover would not have been possible without the French assistance. The Council's structured communication had worked once again.
General Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, gave due credit to the effectiveness of French forces, stating in his memoir, Crusade in Europe, "The Free French had been of inestimable value in the campaign. Without their great assistance, the liberation of France and the defeat of the enemy in Western Europe would have consumed a much longer time, and meant greater losses to ourselves." Despite a stigma of cowardice being placed on the French throughout the war, Jean Moulin's stand created a legacy of resistance deserving of far more recognition than it earns. In one of Moulin's last written testaments, he states, "My task is becoming more and more delicate, while the difficulties increase constantly. I am determined to hold on as long as possible." Though he was not able to hold on for long, Moulin's actions in creating the National Council of Resistance ensured that his commitment to the liberation of France was carried on.